You're gonna do what with that hay, boy? Roy Bannon was laughing before Malik Carter even finished dragging the first moldy bale up the hill. Up, away from the dying pond, not toward it. He's trying to fill a pond with cow bedding. Somebody stop him before he hurts himself. Malik didn't look up. I'm not filling anything, he said, quiet, steady. I'm slowing it down. Slowing what down? There's nothing left to slow. But the salesman's brand new pump sat idling in the lane, and Malik had just turned it down flat. 18 years old, alone, every dollar his grandmother left him on the line. He wasn't trying to fill that pond. So what did that dead woman's notebook tell him the whole county had missed? The pump salesman came on a Thursday morning, and the sound of his trailer reached the farm before he did. Down in the lower pasture, the cows lifted their heads from the dry grass, ears turning toward the lane where an engine coughed, and then settled into a low, hungry idle. Malik Carter heard it too. He was standing at the edge of the pond where he had stood most mornings since the last of the spring rain, looking at water that kept getting smaller. The pond had shrunk into itself. Where it had once reached the roots of the willows, it now sat low and tired inside a ring of cracked mud, the banks curling up at the edges like old paper left too long in the sun. Dragonflies still worked the surface, but even they seemed to be flying in a smaller room than the one they were used to. Malik stood there in a canvas jacket that hung loose off his shoulders, a jacket that had belonged to his grandmother and still smelled faintly of her wood stove and the peppermint she had kept in the pockets. Odessa Carter had raised him on this land, and she had died at the tail end of winter, quiet in her sleep, leaving him 18 years old and holding a farm that half the county assumed would slip through his fingers by fall. He had stopped his last months of school to stay. There had not really been a choice in it, the way he saw things. You did not walk away from the only place that had ever wanted you. So when the trailer rolled up the lane and stopped near the fence, and a man in clean boots stepped down beside a muddy pond, Malik felt the whole weight of the county's watching settle onto his shoulders at once. The man's name was Nolan Reeves, and he talked like every trouble in the world had an engine bolted to the side of it and a price tag hanging off the front. He came around the trailer with 2 hoses looped over one arm and a smile already arranged on his face, and he crossed the muddy ground toward the boy the way a man crosses a room he is sure he already owns. You'd be the young Carter. It was not really a question. I was sorry to hear about your grandmother. She was a fixture around here. He let that sit half a breath before he turned and looked at the pond with something like sympathy, though his eyes were already measuring it. Now, this is a bad one. I've seen ponds come back from worse, but not on their own. And not without help. Malik did not say anything. He had learned in the months since the funeral that silence made men like this show their whole hand faster than any question could. This setup moves water, Nolan went on, pointing back at the machine strapped to the trailer. You pull from the lower creek down there, push it up through the hose, and bring this pond right up before summer gets any meaner than it already is. 2 days of running, and you wouldn't know it was the same hole in the ground. How much? Malik asked. Nolan named the price. Malik did not let anything show on his face, but low in his stomach something pulled tight and cold. It was very nearly the whole of what Odessa had left him, the small, careful sum she had saved over a lifetime of doing without. The money that was supposed to carry the farm and the boy on it through a first year everyone expected him to fail. It was more than the pump. It was the whole cushion between him and going under. Dale Mercer had drifted up to the fence by then. He leaned on the top rail and let out a low whistle. That's a lot of money for a boy just starting out, he said, not unkindly. Roy Bannon beside him laughed the short laugh of a man enjoying somebody else's hard spot. So is losing a pond. You can't run cattle on cracked mud. Nolan gave Malik a careful, practiced smile. Your neighbor's right about that much. If this dries out all the way, you'll spend more hauling water in by the truckload than this pump would ever cost you. I've watched men lose a whole herd being careful with their wallet. And the worst of it was that Malik knew there was truth in it. The pond watered the lower pasture. It caught the runoff after every spring rain. It had carried this farm through dry stretches back when his grandmother was alive to walk it. But even standing there with the salesman's number sitting like a stone in his gut, Malik kept hearing the way Odessa used to talk about that water, and it was nothing like the way this man talked about it. Nolan talked about the pond like it was a hole waiting to be filled. Odessa had talked about it like it was a hand that could hold water just fine, so long as the fingers up the hill above it were not broken. Malik turned and looked away from the pond, up the slope to the north bank, where a shallow wash cut down through the grass like an old scar he had walked past 1,000 times without ever once really seeing it. "I'm not buying the pump," he said. Nolan's smile held, but only barely. "Say again?" "I'm not buying it." Malik said it steadier the second time, though his heart was going hard. "Thank you for driving out." Dale pushed off the fence, his brow working. "Son, you're not buying it? With the pond looking like that?" "No." Roy grinned wide and looked around like he wanted an audience for this. "Well, all right then. What's the plan, boy? Stand out here and pray for rain?" Malik looked at the wash above the north bank one more time. Then he turned toward the barn, and his voice came out quiet and certain in a way that surprised even him. "I'm going to stack hay." By the time the noon heat had flattened the shadows under the barn, Malik was dragging the first of the old square bales out of the loft, and the two men at the fence had settled in to watch him do it like it was the best show to come through the county in months. The bales were the loose, weathered ones, too gray and broken down to feed and too far gone to sell, and they came apart at the strings if he handled them wrong. He handled a lot of them wrong that first hour. His arms learned the weight the hard way. Roy was the one who laughed first. He leaned both forearms on the top rail and shook his head slow, the way a man does when he's already decided how a thing is going to end. "Now I've seen it all. The boy's gonna fill a pond with cow bedding." Dale did not laugh, but the not laughing was its own kind of hard to stand under. "Malik," he called across the yard, "that pond needs water, son. Water, not hay." Malik set a bale down on the wagon bed and straightened his back against the ache already building there. "No," he said. "It needs to stop losing what already comes." He heard the words come out of his own mouth and half wondered where he'd gotten them, except he didn't really wonder. He knew exactly where. They had the shape of his grandmother in them. The men stayed at the fence a while longer, then lost interest the way men do when the person they came to laugh at refuses to look up and give them the satisfaction. Roy said something Malik didn't catch, and Dale answered it, and eventually 2 truck doors opened and shut, and the engine carried them off down the lane toward town, where Malik knew the story of him would be sitting on the counter at the feed store before the dust had settled back onto the road. That was the part that sat heaviest. Not the work he could carry. It was the knowing that every soul between here and the county line had already decided the Carter boy would lose his grandmother's farm before the first frost, and that a wagon load of rotten hay was exactly the kind of foolishness they'd been waiting for him to commit. He was 18, and he was alone with it, and there was no one left at the kitchen table at night to tell him whether he was right. If you've ever been the one everybody was sure would fail, the one they'd already made up their minds about before you got a single chance to prove them wrong, you already know the exact weight the boy was carrying up that hill. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know who's out there. He worked until the light went orange and his hands had stopped being able to feel the twine. Then he washed at the pump by the porch, ate cold cornbread standing up because he was too tired to make anything better of it, and finally did the thing he'd been circling all day without letting himself do. He got down his grandmother's notebook. Odessa had kept it for more than 30 years, and the cover had faded from whatever blue it started as to the soft, rubbed color of a work shirt washed 1,000 times. The corners had gone round and cottony, The pages had swelled from damp hands and summer air until the whole thing sat fatter than a book that size had any right to. She had written in it the things other people never thought to respect. How much rain came and when. How high the pond stood in April against how low it stood in August. Which ditch cut deeper after a hard year. Which field held green the longest into a dry July, and where the ground stayed black with wet after everything around it had gone to dust. Malik turned the pages slow, careful of the corners, until he found the section on the pond. His grandmother's handwriting was small and square and certain, and reading it was the closest thing to hearing her voice he had left. Near the top of a page, she had underlined a single line twice, hard enough that the pencil had nearly gone through the paper. A pond does not die from want of rain. It dies when the rain leaves too fast. Slow the wash above the north bank. He read it once, and then he read it again, and something in his chest that had been clenched since the funeral loosened by a fraction. He turned the page. On the next one, she had drawn a map. It was not a pretty thing, just a pencil sketch, but every line in it meant something. There was the hill, and the north bank, and the old wash cutting down the slope, and the pond at the bottom of it all. And across the face of the slope above the pond, she had drawn a row of small squares, staggered, one set a little below the next. Beside them, in that same square hand, she had written the instructions plain enough that a boy alone in a kitchen could follow them. Bales in staggered rows, catch the silt, slow the brown water, let the pond drink. Malik sat back in the chair and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Outside the window, the pond lay low and gray under the last of the light. And for years, he understood now, everybody who'd looked at it had blamed the sky. Not enough rain, a dry stretch, bad luck. But Odessa had never once looked at the sky when the pond dropped. She'd looked at the hill. That was the whole difference between her and every other person leaning on that fence. They looked at the empty water and saw a problem to be filled. She looked at the ground above it and saw where the water was getting away. She had not left him a full pond. She had left him a reason. He was up before the sun the next morning, and this time when he loaded the wagon, he did not haul the bales down to the water. That was where Dale expected them to go, where anyone would have put them who thought the pond was a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Instead, he took them up, onto the slope, to the shallow cut of the old wash above the north bank, and he set them the way the map told him to. Not in a straight wall. His grandmother had been careful about that, and now, kneeling in the wet grass with her sketch weighted flat under a stone beside him, he understood why. A wall would only dam the water until the water shoved it aside all at once. So he built the rows staggered instead. A bale here, a gap there, another row lower down and offset, leaving space on purpose. Enough room for the water to pass through. Not enough for it to run wild. He was shoulder deep in that work, shoving a bale into place against the slope with the whole weight of his body when he heard the trailer again. Nolan Reeves had come back for a signature he plainly assumed was still waiting for him. He walked up the slope in those same clean boots, picking his way around the mud, and stood looking at the crooked lines of hay running across the hill with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and pity. "You know those won't hold a flood," Nolan said. Malik wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and left a streak of mud there. "I don't need them to hold a flood. A pump would put water in that pond today, right now. You'd stand here and watch it come up." Nolan folded his arms and looked down the slope at the sad, low water. "That there's gonna sit and rot, and you'll be right back where you started, except a summer poorer for it." "And where would the next rain go?" Malik asked him. Nolan opened his mouth, and then he didn't have an answer ready, and the silence stretched out between them until the salesman just shook his head and went back down to his trailer to wait, the way a man waits for weather he's certain is coming to prove him right. Malik went back to work. He packed brush in behind some of the bales to hold them. He drove wooden stakes at the lower corners where the ground gave way. He left the openings exactly where his grandmother's map had left them, trusting a woman in the ground more than the man at the fence. And by the middle of the afternoon, the whole hillside looked strange enough that trucks slowed on the road to gawk. Old hay stacked in crooked rows above a thirsty pond. To anybody who didn't know water, it looked like the work of a boy who'd lost his grip. To Malik, kneeling up there with dirt worked into every crease of his hands, it looked like his grandmother's handwriting made real and laid out across the hill where anyone could read it. If only they knew the language. If your own family ever kept something like that notebook, rainfall notes, pond records, an old hand-drawn map, some scrap of weather wisdom that later turned out dead right, I'd love to hear about it down below. Those things get thrown out all the time, and most of them shouldn't be. Then came the hard part, the waiting. For 2 full days, nothing happened at all. The sky stayed a flat, stubborn white, holding its rain the way a fist holds a coin it hasn't decided to spend. The pond stayed low. The bales sat where he'd put them, dry and pale on top, dark with mud at the bottom, doing nothing a person could see. Roy drove by once each day for no reason Malik could name except to look at the hill and shake his head out the truck window. And each time he did it, the doubt Malik had been holding down rose a little higher in his throat. That was the thing nobody at the fence understood. He wasn't sure. He had gambled nearly everything his grandmother left him on this. Not by spending the money, but by refusing to. By betting the whole summer and his one thin cushion against ruin on the word of a woman in a notebook, instead of the machine on that trailer. And if the hill was wrong, if she was wrong, if a good idea from 30 years back no longer fit the shape of the ground, then he'd have thrown a whole season away arguing with the rain. There was no one to tell him otherwise. There was only the notebook and the bales and the white sky refusing to move. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he walked the wash with the notebook buttoned inside his jacket, hunting for anything. Near the top row, he found the first small thing. Behind one of the bales, where the bare ground usually stayed bare, a little fan of damp silt had gathered. Soft and brown and no bigger than his 2 hands laid flat. Lower, below the 2nd row, grass that had been beaten flat by fast water was standing up again, as if it had remembered which way was up. And near the 3rd row, the wash itself had bent, just slightly, leaning toward the pond bank instead of cutting straight on past it the way it had for years. Small things, almost nothing. But he'd learned enough of his grandmother's language by now to know that a farm speaks first in almost nothing, and that whoever waits for it to shout has usually already missed what it was trying to say. He knelt and pressed 2 fingers into the soft brown silt behind the top bale, and he felt how it held together, how it had settled instead of run. "I hope you were right," he said low to no one who could hear. "I hope I read it right." The rain came that night. It was not a soft rain. It was the hard kind, the kind that hits the roof in fistfuls and wakes a whole house at once. And by the time it had pulled Malik up out of sleep, every ditch and gully on the place had already started talking at the top of its voice. He came awake before midnight to the roar of it and lay there for one breath listening. And then he was up, yanking on his boots, grabbing the flashlight off the shelf by the door and his grandmother's jacket off the hook, out into the wet with the buttons still undone and the rain coming sideways into his face. Water was already coming down the north hill. He could hear it before the flashlight found it, a rushing that was too big and too fast. And when the beam caught it, he saw it running brown and hard down the slope toward the bales. The exact thing the whole night had been built to meet. Down at the fence, headlights. Dale and Roy had come out into it too, drawn by the storm and by the story they'd been telling all week and wanted to see the end of. Nolan's trailer still sat parked near the lane where he'd left it, the man too sure of himself to have hauled it home, still betting the weather would sign his contract for him. "Those bales are gonna wash clean into the pond!" Roy hollered through the rain. "Every one of them!" Malik did not answer. He had no answer to give, and no breath to give it with. He stood at the top of the slope with the rain running off his chin and the flashlight shaking in his fist. And he watched the first hard rush of water reach the top row. It hit the hay, and it did not go over. It spread. Some of it poured through the gaps he'd left on purpose, and some of it slowed and let its mud drop, and the water that came out below the first row was still brown, but it had lost its teeth. Then it reached the second row and spread again and dropped more, and by the third, the water was no longer cutting a line down the hill. It was spilling wide, sheeting, turning toward the pond instead of tearing on past it. And then, halfway down, a bale groaned and shifted and broke loose at the corner. Malik saw it go. It lifted at the end, swung out into the current, and for one long, sick moment the whole thing hung on the edge of coming apart. The rows above it straining, the water shoving. Everything he'd built, and everything he'd bet on it, teetering there in the dark in the beam of a shaking light, while three men who'd never believed him watched from the fence to see it fail. The loose bale swung out on the end of its broken corner, dragged sideways by the water, and then it caught. One of the stakes Malik had driven at the lower edge 2 days before took the weight of it, and the bale shuddered and hung there, half in the current and half out, jammed against the wood. It did not tear free. The rows above it held their line, and the water, meeting the snag, did what his grandmother's map had said it would do all along. It spread wider still, and slowed, and dropped what it was carrying, and kept moving down the hill in a broad, muddy sheet instead of a knife. Malik went down the slope after it with the flashlight jumping in his hand, boots sliding in the mud, close enough now to see the water the way you can only see a thing when you're standing in it. The top row was full to bursting, mud packed thick behind it, water threading out through every gap he'd left. The second row caught what the first let through. By the third, the brown had gone thin and quiet, and where the wash used to cut straight past the north bank and carry the whole storm off the property, it now bent and pooled behind the lowest row, and rose, and slipped through the last opening his grandmother had marked, out onto the bank in a wide, slow fan. He stood there in the rain and watched the first sheet of it slide down into the pond. For one long moment he forgot Dale and Roy at the fence, forgot Nolan's trailer sitting in the lane, forgot the price of the pump and every face in the county that had already decided he'd fail. He forgot the whole weight of being 18 and alone with a farm nobody thought he could hold. He only saw the water going into the pond instead of past it. He only saw the thing the land had been losing all these years, finally being kept. The bales groaned again somewhere above him, and one more shifted, but the rows held the way they needed to. Not forever, just long enough. That was all Odessa had ever asked of them, and he understood it now with the rain running down inside his collar. Long enough for the storm to spend itself against the hay instead of against the bank. Long enough to teach one hard rain a different set of manners than it had learned. Down at the fence, the shouting had stopped. Nobody was calling out anymore about bales washing away. There was only the sound of the rain easing, and the water finding its slower way home. By morning, the storm had moved off east and left the whole valley steaming. Mist stood over the pasture in low white sheets, and the light came through it soft and gray. Malik had not really slept. He'd come in near dawn and sat at the kitchen table in his wet clothes with the notebook open in front of him. And when there was finally enough light to see by, he went back out to look at what the night had done. The pond was not full. He'd never once expected it to be full, and he would have distrusted it if it were. But the waterline had come up, not by some inch a man had to squint and imagine. By inches, anybody with eyes could stand there and count. The nearest ring of cracked mud, the one that had been dry and curling the morning the salesman came, was gone under water now. The grass right at the edge lay bent and heavy where the new wet had reached it. And up in the wash, a thin trickle was still running down off the hill, clearer than it had been in the dark, carrying less mud and something that felt to Malik a good deal like a promise. Dale was the first one down. Malik heard the truck on the lane and looked up to find the older man walking out across the wet grass with his hands pushed deep in his pockets, and Roy coming along a few steps behind him. Both of them slow, both of them quiet in a way they had not been all week. Dale stopped at the edge of the pond and stood looking at the risen water a good while before he said anything at all. "Well," he said finally, "just that." Roy came up beside him and stared at the same water. "I figured they'd all wash away," he admitted, and there was none of the laughing left in his voice now. "Every last one of them, straight down into the mud." "One did," Malik told him. Roy looked up the slope to where the crooked rows still ran across the hill, battered and leaning, but standing. "But the rest of them held. They only had to hold through the worst of it," Malik said. And they did. Nolan came out later that morning, and he came slower than he had the day he drove up selling. He had a clipboard with him, though there was nothing left to write on it that would do him any good, and he walked the length of the wash with his clean boots ruined now, stopping at each row. He looked at the silt caught thick behind the bales. He looked at the banks that had softened overnight instead of washing away. He looked at the water line standing higher than it had in months. When he was done walking it, he came and stood near Malik at the pond's edge, and whatever he'd come to say seemed to take him a moment to get in order. "The pump would have raised it faster," Nolan said at last. "Yes," Malik answered. He wasn't going to argue the point because it was true and they both knew it. It would have. But it wouldn't have fixed that. Nolan lifted his chin toward the cut above the north bank, toward the wash that had been carrying the farm's water off the property for years before anybody thought to look at it. He said it like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying around a long time without knowing its weight. Malik did not answer him. He didn't need to. The hill had already said it plainer than either of them could. A county water technician came out 2 days after that. Her name was Marion Pike, and she had the kind of steady, unhurried face that made people stop explaining themselves halfway through a sentence, because they could see she'd already understood. She walked the hillside with Odessa's notebook open in one hand and a measuring rod in the other, and she took her time about it. She checked the wash and the rows of bales, and the fans of silt settled behind them. She checked the soft, new edge of the pond. Then she turned and looked at Malik, who was standing back out of her way with his heart going harder than he wanted to admit. "Your grandmother understood runoff," Marion said. Something moved in Malik's throat that he had to work to get past. "She understood everything," he said. "If you gave her enough rain to prove it." Marion looked back down at the notebook, at the square, certain handwriting and the pencil map, and a small, approving line came into the corner of her mouth. "The pond wasn't just low because it needed water," she said. "It was low because this hill was shedding water too fast. Every hard rain, it dumped the whole load off the property before the ground could take a drink. These bales slowed it down enough to show the water where it used to go." She tapped the rod against the softened edge of the wash. "You didn't fill the pond. You gave it its old road back." Dale had come out again to hear it, and he stood scratching the back of his neck, working through the thing at his own pace. "So the pump would have worked," he said slowly, half a question. Marion looked at him a good long while before she answered, long enough that Roy, off at the fence, got there on his own. "But if that wash kept cutting straight past the pond," Roy said, careful like a man who'd surprised himself, "he'd just keep paying to pour water back in that the land was throwing away. Every dry spell, over and over." Nolan lowered his clipboard the rest of the way to his side. Nobody laughed. There was nothing there to laugh at, and every man on that hill had finally come around to seeing it. By the end of the week, Malik had done the rest of what Marion told him. He replaced the bale that had broken loose and packed brush and stones in behind the rows where the water had shown the weak places, and he scattered grass seed along the contour where she'd walked it out for him with the rod. The hay was never meant to be the whole fix, and he understood that now the way Odessa must have understood it when she drew the map. The bales were the first lesson, not the last word. They'd slowed the water long enough to show where a permanent strip of grass ought to run across the slope. They'd caught enough silt to start building the wash back up toward level. They'd proved, to him and to everybody at the fence, that the pond had never lost its way to drink. It had only been standing at the bottom of a hill that had forgotten how to let it. Over the month that followed, the north bank changed. Grass came back green along the lines where the fast water had been cutting bare. The wash softened and filled and lost its hard edges. The pond held its level after the smaller rains that came through, not perfectly, not the way a poured concrete basin holds a line, but the way an old farm pond holds it when the land above has remembered its job. Some mornings Malik walked the slope just to look at it, and it stopped being strange to him. The crooked rows going soft and grassed over, and started being ordinary, which was better. One evening near the end of that month, Dale stopped by while Malik was down at the lower row, checking the stakes and tying off a piece of twine that had worked loose. The older man leaned on the fence and looked up the hill a while before he spoke. "I thought you were fixing the pond," Dale said. Malik finished the knot and gave it a tug to set it. "I was." Dale lifted a hand toward the whole green face of the slope. The grassed-in wash, the settled rows, the water standing quiet at the bottom of it. "Looks to me like you fixed the hill." Malik felt something come up in him that was close to a smile, the first one that had made it all the way to his face in a long while. "That was how she fixed the pond," he said. "She never once fixed the pond. She always fixed the hill above it." Dale took off his cap and turned it over in his hands. "I only ever saw the water missing," he admitted. "All these years. Blamed the sky like everybody else." Malik looked toward the notebook which he'd brought out with him and set on the seat of the wagon, its faded blue cover soft in the last of the light. "She saw where it was leaving," he said. "That was the whole thing she knew that nobody else bothered to learn." That night he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the pond page, the same page he'd read by lamplight the evening the salesman first drove off down the lane. The old pencil lines were smudged where 30 years of her hands had rested on them. Underneath the last thing his grandmother had written there, he took up a pencil of his own and added a line in a hand that was still learning to be as sure as hers. Rain slowed. Pond rose. North Wash holding. He looked at it a moment, then he set the pencil down again and added one thing more. "You were right." He left the notebook open on the table until the ink had dried, the way you leave a window cracked a little on a warm night. And outside in the dark, the frogs had started up again from the pond. Not many of them, not the full chorus the place used to have when he was small and Odessa was alive and the water stood high against the willows. Just a few. Just enough. The sound came in through the open window uneven and soft, like the farm clearing its throat after a long, dry silence, testing whether it still had a voice. Malik stood in the dark kitchen and listened to it. The pond had not come back all at once, and he'd known better than to expect it would. Good things on a farm rarely arrive that way. But the water had stayed. And staying, he was learning, was where every kind of healing has to start. The rain had never abandoned the place. The hill had only forgotten how to slow down long enough to keep any of it. And a man had looked at the empty water and seen a machine to sell, while a boy of 18, with muddy hands and a dead woman's notebook, had looked at the land above it and seen a lesson instead. He had followed the lesson. He'd stacked old hay and ruined his hands, and stood out in a midnight storm and waited on a rain that everyone swore would make a fool of him, and the pond had begun to fill. Not because he forced more water into it, because he finally learned to hold what already came. And maybe that's the part worth carrying out of a story like this, and into your own life. Because most of us, when something in our lives runs dry, a bank account, a friendship, a stretch of hope, we do exactly what the salesman did. We look straight at the empty place and start hunting for something to pour into it, fast, whatever it costs. We reach for the pump. But every so often, the problem was never that too little was coming in. It was that too much was running out, too fast, through a gap up the hill we never thought to look at. And no amount of pouring will ever get ahead of a leak you refuse to go find. Odessa Carter knew that. She spent 30 years learning to look above the empty place instead of straight at it. And she left it all in a faded blue notebook for a grandson who was brave enough, and lonely enough, to believe her when the whole county laughed. Sometimes the answer really isn't forcing more in. Sometimes it's learning how to hold on to what already comes. So let me leave you with this. Wherever you're watching from tonight, think about the thing in your own life that keeps running dry, no matter how much you pour into it. Then ask yourself the question Malik finally asked the hill. Not, how do I fill this back up, but where is it getting away from me? That one change, in where you look, can change everything. If this story found you at the right time, do me a small favor and pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. Someone standing at the edge of their own dry season, reaching for the pump. Drop your city in the comments so I know where you're listening from. And if your family ever handed down an old, stubborn piece of wisdom that the world laughed at, right up until the day it turned out true, tell me about it. I read every one. The frogs kept on out in the dark. Malik listened until the lamp burned low, and then he closed the notebook gentle over the new line and let the old house go quiet around him. And for the first time since the winter, the silence did not feel like something he had to carry alone.